I was really blown away by the previous talk. I know some of you were here for the previous talk. I found it to be very deep. By comparison, I want to lower your expectations or perhaps raise them a little bit into the shallower realm of the coastal environment. My talk today is going to focus on our local California coastal bottlenose dolphins. I say our local, they are now. 40 years ago, none of them were here. And so they become our neighbors along the central and northern California coast, coming first here to Monterey Bay, and now regularly up into San Francisco Bay, and as we'll talk about further along the coastline. I don't have a whole slide about this, but I will say this is a team effort. I work at the Marine Mammal Center, and I work with a number of research associates, including Bill Keener, Mark Weber. I work with graduate students, and also Julia, who's here. Thanks for coming, from the Monterey Bay campus. So most of our work, we study really a number of cetaceans in San Francisco Bay and the surrounding areas out to the Gulf of the Farallones, but most of our work is focused on 4 species. The first, actually inside San Francisco Bay, became a regular, was the harbor porpoise. And harbor porpoises were actually absent from San Francisco Bay for a long, long time. The last ones in San Francisco Bay were basically eliminated in World War II. And that is because there was a large submarine net that was actually strung beneath the Golden Gate Bridge or just out from it during World War II. And that eliminated the last of the harbor porpoise. And so it's only been relatively recently, in the last 15 years or so, that we've had harbor porpoises come back inside the bay. Of course, we have them along the coastline. And our group has used the Golden Gate Bridge as a platform of opportunity to observe these very shy animals. And we have published the first work describing their reproductive behavior. We kind of had the opportunity to sneak a peek into their bedroom, as it were. What we found was kind of weird. We originally wanted to title the paper, San Francisco Bay Leftists, because the males always approach the females from the left-hand side, and they had this sort of asymmetrical breeding behavior. And subsequently, we did some work with colleagues examining post-mortem specimens of the female reproductive tract. It turns out there's sort of a lock and key type mechanism, very rare in any kind of mammal that we see in these harbor porpoises. I said we originally were going to call them San Francisco Leftists. We have a new paper now in press that is making comparisons all over the world, and with new drone footage. People have gotten better views of the breeding behavior of this species all over the world, and it turns out they are leftists everywhere. Males will always approach from the left-hand side. They may start on the right, but they always end up copulating in this sort of asymmetrical way. That's the smallest cetacean we see. This is the one we're going to focus on today, the coastal California bottlenose dolphin, much larger dolphin. Well, let's call it a small whale because it's whale fest. It is a cetacean like the whales, and we're going to talk more about dolphins and some of their amazing capabilities the rest of this talk. As I said, they are relatively recent, right? Coming up the coast out of Southern California, beginning in the 1990s through into the 2000s and really 2010s and onward. So over the last sort of 13, 14 years, we've seen more and more of them, especially in San Francisco Bay and along the coastline between here, San Francisco, and areas further north. We also study gray whales. And for a long time, this kind of focused on their migration as they kind of scooted on by. But with the most recent unusual mortality event for gray whales, what we've seen is not only whales dying along our coastline, but more and more of them staying for prolonged periods of time and actually coming right inside San Francisco Bay, quite far into the bay, areas like around Angel Island, and feeding. And so we have confirmed for the first time with stomach content analyses from dead animals that they are feeding. And we just recently, our research team, one of the graduate students I work with, Becca Lane, ran a trip out, and they got some of the first drone footage of gray whales actively feeding in San Francisco Bay. So that's something else we've been working with colleagues on. A concern for these gray whales, as they're hungry, they're coming into this busy port, is ship strike risk. And that is a secondary cause of death, in addition to starvation for some animals, because there's not enough food for them up in the Arctic where they typically feed. They're trying to find places to get a snack when they're hungry. And they come inshore, and that puts them right in the shipping lanes. And then we've also been studying humpback whales, very much like the humpback whales you get here, inside San Francisco Bay, along the shoreline, and out into the Gulf of the Farallones. We do photo identification with them, study their haunts and habits, as it were. We know that the whales that we get up in our area belong to the endangered Central American breeding group, and also the threatened Mexican breeding group. So these are not the super abundant or relatively abundant recovered humpback whales that breed in Hawaii and feed in Alaska. These are humpbacks that come here, I think, as most of the locals would know, to feed here in Monterey Bay, San Francisco Bay, and surrounding waters in the Gulf of the Farallones. For humpback whales as well, right, areas we're interested in studying and have been engaged in actively concerned with include ship strike risk, ship strike mortality, and entanglement in fisheries, two causes of death for these endangered and threatened populations. And just in case, I mean, I don't know how much you guys know about ship strike risk, but a lot of times people will say, oh, if a boat hits the whale, does the boat get hurt? Because the whales are so big, right? But in fact, when you see, a humpback whale or a gray whale next to a 1,000-foot-long container ship or a fast ferry or something like that, the size difference is about like if you or I laid down, on the runway at SFO and had a 747 run over us. There have been cases where there was, even witnessed ship strikes, and the skipper said, I didn't see any whale, I didn't feel any whale, and I believe them, right? So of course, the Marine Mammal Center, we are engaged in efforts to help everybody, encourage everybody, as a sanctuary is as well, to slow down. Slow down some of that traffic. I personally don't mind, if I get my Amazon delivery a little bit later. I don't know about you, if fewer whales are killed in the process. I also love crab, but I don't mind if the season is a bit more restricted. I know this can be a sensitive topic, but again, so that fewer whales are killed or harmed. And we also have, I should add, and Julie, who's here in attendance, is part of that team, a team that goes out and helps to disentangle whales caught in crab nets and fisheries. But today, there we go. Today, I'm going to focus on the little guys. We're going to talk about primarily the bottlenose dolphin, but just as a sort of introduction to two small cetaceans that you are likely to see very near shore, and yes, you can see them from the beach here in Monterey Bay and along the coast between here and San Francisco Bay and beyond, are harbor porpoises and bottlenose dolphins. How do you tell the difference? Well, harbor porpoises are really small. They have these triangular dorsal fins, as you can see here on the left side. Do I have a laser? Doesn't really work. Anyway, the triangular dorsal fins. They don't really have a beak. They have a very sort of short rostrum. And they have blunt, or what we sometimes call spade-shaped teeth. So if you look at the skull of a porpoise, the teeth, they almost look like little tiny tuning pegs on a guitar or a ukulele or something like that. They kind of bud out like that. The name porpoise comes from the Latin for pigfish. Dolphins, especially bottlenose, they're much larger. They often appear gray. They have a curved, or we call it falcate dorsal fin. They have a beak, hence the name bottlenose. And they have cone-shaped, pointed, conical teeth. And the origin of the word dolphin, it comes from the Greek Delphus. So here's again sort of a look at the differences. if you see these animals out in the wild, we often get folks confused, right? About did I see a dolphin or did I see a porpoise? And if you send us a sighting, it can be helpful to kind of know what you're looking at. Also, if you happen to get a photograph, then we can usually confirm it. And if it's a very good photograph, as I'll talk about, we might be able to tell you which dolphin or porpoise you actually saw. So I have a quick question for you guys. Actually, before this, a quick question. What animal has the largest brain on Earth? A little crowd interaction. The sperm whale, very right. Physeter macrocephalus, macro meaning large, the cephalon, the head. Of course, most of that head is filled with sperm, right? Is that right? No. No, the early whalers thought it was sperm. I don't think they were as savvy as you. Of course, there's not sperm in a whale's head any more than in a person's head, but a large sound-producing organ, right? The spermatocyte organ, which they use to communicate acoustically in the deep sea, pulverize prey, and find prey, right? But they do have the largest brain on Earth. That's not really fair, though, right? Because the whales are like kind of big. So the question is, what animal among the vertebrates now? Okay, not super light like ants or something. Okay, what animal has the highest brain-to-body mass ratio? Does anybody know? We call it an EQ, encephalization quotient. No. No, it's a primate. There we go. Okay, let's go to the head of the class. There we are. Homo sapiens. We have the highest brain-to-body mass ratio of any animal on Earth. In a previous lifetime, I taught at the University of Texas, and some students would stand up and shout, "I'm not an animal." But then you have to ask, what are you, a fungus? What are you if you're not an animal? But the second, so here's us. Woo-hoo. The second, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, on down, are all members of the dolphin family, including, of course, the bottlenose dolphins. So they're very brainy animals. And dolphins in particular are amazing social mammals. This is not a bottlenose dolphin. This is a dusky dolphin I photographed through the water. It's actually looking at me. It was bow riding the boat. And dolphins have very good vision in both air and water. It's because they have a flexible lens. They have excellent hearing, of course, and live in an acoustic world. They can echolocate. And they also have these really big brains. And big brains, including your own big brain, generally in terms of evolution, is associated with rich social lives, right? They're slow to mature and reproduce, or we call K-selected, and their social relationships are key to their survival and reproduction, okay? So like in the human world, right, we often say it's not just what you know, it's who you know. That is very much the case for dolphins. So when we talk about the odontocetes in general, the toothed whales, and dolphins specifically, socially they're very, very different creatures than, say, those baleen whales, the humpbacks and the gray whales. Although they're all related, these guys live in social groups and do everything together. One of my mentors at UC Santa Cruz is the late, great Ken Norris. And he once famously said, a lone dolphin is not a dolphin, right? Because they're such social creatures. So the dolphin family Delphinidae, is the largest family of cetaceans. There are 17 genera, 36 species, and they include many species that are called whale, like pilot whales, false killer whales, killer whales. The largest, of course, is the orca, or killer whale, at about 9.5 meters. The smallest is a little Hector's dolphin. Lives in New Zealand, sometimes called the down under dolphin. Those little dolphins, I can tell you, when they are pregnant, they get very, very round. I mean, they're sort of a minimum size to have a baby that's ready to pop out with a big brain and swim and make it to the surface. And so they come out like little rugby balls, and they're really, really huge. In fact, one of the ways for all the dolphins that we recognize newborns, does anybody know? Something we call fetal folds. They're actually kind of accordioned up inside the mother. I'll show you some pictures of it for bottlenose in a minute. But when they pop out, they kind of expand. So they're really, really crunched in there. Very true for the world's smallest dolphin, the Hectors.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What about the vaquita? I thought that was the smallest.
The vaquita is the smallest cetacean. The vaquita, like the harbor porpoise, is a porpoise. Okay. So it's not a member of the dolphin family. Thank you. And it's also the most endangered cetacean as well. Dolphins, and dolphin lore has a rich history. This is from the island of Crete. I actually had the opportunity to visit this when I was a few years younger, when I was a teenager, actually. But a wonderful depiction of dolphins. And notice the whole ecology, right? The fish and the benthic creatures all in this wonderful depiction from nearly 2,000 years ago. So let's take a look at the bottlenose dolphin. They are a relatively large-bodied dolphin. They have different forms, some larger than others, as we'll talk about, anywhere from 2 to 3.5 meters in length. And they're long-lived. So unlike some of those harbor porpoises that we study that, you really only get a few years with them, these guys you can keep track of for decades. And in fact, we've made use of that. Bottlenose dolphins, typically we see a fission-fusion society, not unlike those of chimpanzees, perhaps not unlike our own, right? Where groups form and split and reform. We see cooperation, a lot of play behavior, problem-solving behavior, and they're particularly interactive with people, right? So it might be the wrong phrase to say they're the most domesticatable dolphin because you cannot domesticate a dolphin, but they do readily use people as kind of social companions. And so we see a number of cases around the world where we have lone sociable dolphins. I'll talk about one in San Francisco Bay in a minute, where they've kind of left their own kind to some extent and started hanging out more with people. There are also cooperative relationships between bottlenose dolphins and fishers, native fisheries in various places around the world. And this propensity has led there to be more bottlenose dolphins traditionally in captivity than any other species. And whatever you feel about that, the good news about that is we've learned a lot about them, right? About their cognitive capabilities, tool use, problem solving, echolocation, et cetera, thanks to these captive studies. So bottlenose dolphins are found in coastal areas around the world. You could see here where I did my PhD research in New Zealand. We had bottlenose dolphins. In fact, these are pictures that I took in the Marlborough Sounds of bottlenose dolphins. And yes, of course, we have them here along the west coast of North America. Now, there are two forms along our shores. There's a coastal and an offshore ecotype. The offshore ecotype is quite a bit larger and more wide-ranging than the coastal form. So the coastal form is what I'm going to talk about today. I warned you after the last talk that was so deep, really, in more ways than one. I was blown away by it. This is going to be very shallow. We're talking about animals that you could wade out or swim out to, and you're going to see pictures of them in a minute taken from shore from people walking along the beach in amongst the surfers. Okay, so that's kind of how you tell the difference, size, and also typically where you find them, very, very inshore. A little bit also difference in color. So those offshore forms tend to be sort of darker. This is a member of our research team, Mark Weber, took this picture of an offshore ecotype form, bottlenose dolphin in Baja. Now, we know that both porpoises and bottlenose dolphins were in San Francisco Bay historically. And we know that from the Emeryville Shell Mound. If you've ever been up to the East Bay and gotten off at the Shell Mound exit, you're probably going to IKEA. That's what's there now. But once upon a time, there was this huge shell mound, this native midden. And within those remains were found both harbor porpoise bones and bottlenose dolphin bones. We are actually in the process of genotyping the bottlenose dolphin bones. We suspect it may actually be the offshore form that somehow ended up there. But it could be the inshore form. We don't know as of yet. We were kind of slowed up by COVID. So bear with us, but we should have more news on that soon. So here's what the general story has been. If you go back to the 1980s, until 1983, The coastal bottlenose dolphins along California were confined mainly to the Southern California Bight area and on down into Baja, Mexico. That was the limit. And I note here that this is a very small population. California coastal bottlenose dolphin population is only about 650 individuals. Next they came right here to Monterey Bay, starting in the 80s and especially into the 1990s. You started to have a lot of bottlenose dolphins here. This move appears to have coincided with a major El Nino event, and we suspect that warming waters have something to do, either in terms of making it more comfortable for them to move north, sort of a draw, or maybe less comfortable down south, kind of pushing one way or the other. And then subsequently on up into San Francisco Bay, along the surrounding coastline, and areas further north into Sonoma and Mendocino County. And as we'll talk about, some ranging further north still into the states of Oregon and Washington. So this is some pictures of dolphins in San Francisco Bay here in 2008, 2015, underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. Here's a picture taken from the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, one of the things you'll notice, you see all those marks on the bottlenose dolphins? Bottlenose dolphins are among the largest member of the dolphin family, and they are notoriously aggressive. They're very brutish. So those marks, nobody did that to that dolphin except another dolphin. Those are rake marks from another dolphin, and they kind of compete aggressively for access to mates, and they're just kind of rough in general. The nice thing about that is it makes them very well marked and easy to identify the different individuals. It's much easier, for example, to identify these guys than individual harbor porpoises. Here we could see a group, and I told you, really close to shore, right? Right along Ocean Beach in San Francisco in 2020. Here we are in Half Moon Bay, some guys out fishing, Half Moon Bay up the coast here. I live in Half Moon Bay. That's not me. I do not surf at Mavericks. I'm a wipeout artist, and Mavericks is a little bit too major for me. But here are some dolphins and a surfer looking on at Mavericks. Here's a dolphin surfing, again with surfers, a bit further north, up in Sonoma County. And here, just in case that surfing incident wasn't big enough for you, how is that for a group of bottlenose dolphins? Again, and this is just this past year off Sonoma County. I think the headline for this was "Dolphins Surfing a Tsunami," right? I don't know if it's quite a tsunami, but it's a big wave. All right. So here you can see sort of the sightings that we have gathered, some of the locations of those sightings with identification photos, some sightings without identification photos. You can see some right down into the bay. And a lot of the identifications for bottlenose dolphins, while we do get some from boats and coastal surveys, a lot of them come from shore. And a lot of them come from folks like you. As was mentioned, I was actually the first person to use digital photography on a large scale to identify individual cetaceans. And at the time, people said, "You're crazy. Digital cameras will never supplant film cameras in individual identification." Now everybody uses them. And what's more, the technology is so readily available and so cheap, many of you, many of your friends probably have digital SLR cameras. And even if you don't, even an iPhone, if the dolphin's close enough, you may get an ID quality shot. And if you get that, you can send it to us. I'll show you that later. So here's a look at the Golden Gate bathymetry. As you come in through the Golden Gate, we hit this very deep area. This is sort of looking out from the bay and through the deep channel at the Golden Gate Strait. And this is, of course, a kind of a pinch point. There's a lot of fish that gather there. Harbor porpoises feed there. Humpback whales feed there. There's a lot of vessel traffic that goes to and from there. But for these bottlenose dolphins, that's deeper water than they like. And yet somehow, they've moved through this and beyond.
Is it cold?
It is pretty cold.
Like colder than like a welling kind of a cold?
No, it'd be typical cold for this area. You get deep water close to shore here as well, mind you. But along this area, right, your dolphins will tend to be right along the coast. Here they have an area right along the coast. You kind of wonder, right, how they get across. So San Francisco Bay, it's one of the largest estuaries in the world. The entrance is widest and deepest body of water in their range. And this means that the question is, did they get across the channel, here where it's right at the Golden Gate Bridge, where it's about a kilometer and a half, or across 4 kilometers at the outer end? We don't know where they get across, but we know they've gone across. And this is into typically deeper water than you find coastal bottlenose dolphins. Now, how do we keep track of them? I mentioned photo identification. So we've been regularly doing photo identification since 2010. We also have some photo records from earlier than that. And first sightings in San Francisco Bay and the surrounding coastline, as I said, in the 90s. There were also folks doing some research, including Mark Cotter, down in this area when the dolphins first arrived here. And we compared notes with them. We'll talk about that. So we can use the unique fin profiles to get to know them. Here's a photograph of a gumpy, an individual photograph. And you can see here, not too shy around surfers in Marin County at Rodeo Beach. And when we look at different features, we can look at how many specific markings they have. This guy with 0 markings, we probably cannot identify them. As I said, fortunately for this species, that's relatively rare. We can identify most of the individuals that we encounter. Here's a look at a Monterey Bay individual that was photographed later. And one of the things that we need to do is get regular photographs of the individuals because they acquire these marks over time. They don't lose them. They don't heal over or anything, but they can change. And so we can see this changed marking. And in case you don't believe that marks evolve, here's an example here. Is this the same guy between June 2016 and September 2020? And the answer is, yep, if we overlay those images, we can see that leading edge was injured. It might have been a propeller injury. That is not a typical injury they would get from a conspecific, from another dolphin, that big dent in the front of the fin. So it might have had some kind of run-in with a small vessel, for example. We also get a lot of information from members of the community science, citizen science observers. And here's somebody just walking the beach at Half Moon Bay in my neighborhood, getting a photo of a member of our catalog. And I'm sorry, my talk was very large, and I downgraded the resolution just to make it simpler. So sorry if the photos are a little bit fuzzy, but you can sort of see it anyway. So we currently have in our catalog 120 adult bottlenose dolphins. And here's an example, Bliss, a female first seen in San Diego in the early 1980s, in 1982. Again, out of 650, best estimate for the stock at this point, that's a significant proportion have come up into Northern California. Now, what we don't know, and we're working with colleagues down in San Diego to sort of revise, is what is the overall status? Like, how many, has the population actually grown as it's expanded, or is it the same small number of animals and they just spread out over a larger area? Some of this effort is being assisted through automated image matching, such as Flukebook, and some of you may be familiar with Happy Whale, so there are new algorithms to do this. I was part of the development of the first one of these called FinScan back in the early 2000s. So here's our discovery curve for dolphins. You can see going back to 2007, we had a few. And again, these are only the ones that we photographically identified. So there have been a few sightings, but we didn't have individual identifications, leading on up to 2021 here, where we have as many as 120.
Tim, is that graph just in the Bay Area?
Yeah, that's strictly for the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm going to show some comparisons to Monterey Bay in a minute. So one of the things that we found that's kind of cool is, I mentioned sort of lone sociable dolphins before. We had this one dolphin, Kaimi is her name, and she would hang out in Alameda. And she was a very resident. She stuck around a very small area. Most of the bottlenose dolphins I'm talking about, they move in and out of areas, and I'll show it in a minute. They go between here and San Francisco Bay and other areas. She was always here, just off Alameda. She became very, very popular with the local kayaking club. They sort of adopted her. So here's a picture of Kaimi in her sort of regular haunts. Here she is a year later. So that's looking from the East Bay across towards the city. And you can see we're inside the Bay Bridge. So we're quite far into the bay here. For a time, she hung out with a second dolphin, Ark. But they stayed there for years and years. Now, I can tell you, she's not there anymore. I said until 2019, she left. And she rejoined a larger group of bottlenose dolphins and has been seen elsewhere since. So she hung out in this localized, very localized area for a long time. She's clearly fine. She's healthy. She's moved on and rejoined other groups and moved out of the bay and along the shore. And if you happen to get a photograph of her, please send it to us. Another resident that was in San Francisco Bay quite a lot is Ernestina. And so we could see we've got photographs of her 39 times. And that includes, we know she's a female, and whoops, that lower one there, laser's not working yet. You can see she has a prolapsed uterus there. That can happen in dolphins, again, because the babies are so large. She survived that event, so she's doing okay. Here's another individual, Minerva, who hung out in this marina for 33 days. So again, not too shy around people and ports are our coastal bottlenose dolphins. I told you, you could see them right there, maybe out the window. Okay. So we have a new paper just out in press right now on the northern range expansion of the California coastal bottlenose dolphins. And this compares our photo catalog from San Francisco Bay Area, Monterey Bay, and Southern California over this 40-year period. And so this kind of shows you the study areas that we're talking about. Our primary area is the big box B there, which is sort of inset here, but then comparisons to here, Monterey Bay, and the Southern California Bight. And so here's what we see. If we go back to the 1980s, there were no sightings of bottlenose dolphins in San Francisco Bay Area. Early on, they hadn't made it up this far yet. As we go to include the 1990s, we have dolphins coming up into Monterey Bay. Now, I want to be clear about this. These are the dolphins that we see in the north. Now, there are still presumably quite a few dolphins that have stayed down south and not ventured north. And that's an area for further investigation. Now we get up into the 2000s. We start to see them in San Francisco Bay. And now areas further north. So this is just the areas with sort of greatest density of sightings. And to show you that in a kernel density map, right, this is sort of showing you, notice, very coastal. We're not out in deep waters. We're in a very sort of narrow strip along the coastline in the SoCal Bight in the 80s, starting to move up more in the 90s, 2000s. We were kind of solidly, a lot of them here in Monterey Bay, and in the 2010s here in areas further north. And this is just kind of a close-up of where we saw the greatest density in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. You see lots more in Monterey Bay in 2010s, all the way up along. So these are sort of broad descriptions of where we find all these animals, but let's talk about different individuals. We have some different patterns of movement. Some have shown a pretty steady progression north. So this is Bliss, and this is Bliss, again, over about nearly a 40-year period from the first photographs of her in 1982 to the most recent was 2018. And you could see her moving up out of the SoCal Bight area into Monterey Bay for several years, then up to San Francisco Bay, and then traversing on up for areas further north into Mendocino and Sonoma counties, and then coming back down to the bay. But we've also had back and forth movers, right? Who went from, so this is Ernestina, would go to and from San Francisco Bay and Monterey Bay routinely. And also back and forth movers between Southern California down to Baja, Mexico, to Monterey Bay, and to San Francisco Bay. You follow all that? That's Smooch. Maybe I should show you Smooch in a little more detail. Now, what I've done here with this picture is I've kind of just focused you on the narrow strip of coastline, which is her world, right? The Sierra Nevada mountains aren't her world. That deep offshore area is not her world either. She's 38 years old, presumed females, based on the fact she's been seen with calves a couple of those years. So here we are in San Diego in the early 1980s, then up to Santa Barbara, then up to Monterey Bay, where she was photographed in 1992 and 1994, then back down to Santa Barbara, where she was photographed in 1998 and 1999, then down to Ensenada, Mexico, where she was photographed in 2000, then back up to Santa Monica, where she was photographed in 2001, then back up to San Francisco in 2012, 2013, and on up to Bodega Bay in 2012. So each of these, we could see the number of times that she was photographed. It was more than once in each year that she was photographed at each of those locations. We also had a new long-distance traveling record for coastal bottlenose dolphins anywhere in the world, and it occurred along our coastline for this individual Miss. And so Miss, early photographs had her right down there at the Mexican border in San Diego. She moved up to here, to Monterey Bay. There was a bit of back and forth movement, but then she continued her march north and eventually arrived in Puget Sound. So here's that long distance record, a 1,000-mile trek. She's been seen in the San Francisco Bay Area 18 times over the last 8 years. And our last local photograph of her was in 2017. And this is where she was photographed. Think about a dolphin that started her life in San Diego and Baja, and now she's here. So again, this didn't happen by accident, right? This is probably a pretty strong indication of a changing world, right? A changing marine environment. And some of this may have to do with some of these unusual environmental events, which are becoming more common, like El Niños, right? So here we can see an individual, or actually a couple of dolphins, monitored during an El Niño season. And we can see they were down in San Francisco in February, and they jumped up in the spring all the way up to Mendocino County, and then they came back down again subsequently. So if we look at the travel patterns of the individual dolphins included in this study, we had a substantial portion that were kind of northern, we might call them residents. That is, we consistently see them in San Francisco and Monterey Bay. We had more than half continue to go back to be range-wide travelers, and then a very small percentage, right? Just 6 individuals that were really pretty resident in the San Francisco Bay Area, stuck around that area. So there's kind of a little bit of variability in terms of what they're doing. And again, those individuals that we'd see consistently in San Francisco Bay Area, we'd have many, many more sightings of those. The others, we'd see them sort of passing through and we'd have fewer sightings. Now, as they're moving up the coast, right, they're changing the ecology, aren't they? Because there were never bottlenose dolphins here, although we got to check the midden data. But in any recent period, there were never bottlenose dolphins up here. So these are individual dolphins that started their lives in San Diego, Baja, LA. Do you see a lot of salmon in San Diego? No. And so here we have instances, a couple recorded cases, and for each recorded case, there's probably many more of them feeding on salmon. We're seeing, of course, many of them are up here regularly and to stay, and they're having babies up here. And so I mentioned before those fetal folds. You see those stripes on that dolphin? That's a baby. That is a newborn neonate dolphin, indication it's been born within the last couple of weeks. So we see that, and we see mothers coming back with their calves repeatedly to use our area. Now, the other thing that occurred with this northern move is they started to encounter harbor porpoises. There are not harbor porpoises down in San Diego. In LA, we begin to encounter harbor porpoises along our coastline, and we had a large uptick in what's been called porpoiside. That is lethal attacks on harbor porpoises. So here's one observed here in Monterey Bay in 2009, a picture by our colleague Tom Jefferson. And again, just to remind you, kind of the relative size of these two species, these porpoises are about the size of a dolphin calf, relatively speaking. And one of the things that you see in our dear departed colleague, Izzy Shaponiak, actually published on is infanticide in bottlenose dolphins. They will sometimes, the young males will kill calves, and it's thought to be part of the breeding competition, sort of like lions, male lions, when they capture a pride, will sometimes kill the cubs. So it's possible that it's some kind of outgrowth of that behavior, this porpoiside. We don't really know why it happens, but we know that it happens. And so here's a couple recent publications. The Marine Mammal Center, our pathology department, is continuing to really investigate causes of death for harbor porpoise, and a major cause of death, so major that it was actually declared an unusual mortality event in recent years since their arrival, has been bottlenose dolphins. So just reminding you, this is what the dolphins were doing, right? Until 1983, they were never seen north of Point Conception, and here is the range of the harbor porpoise. So it's a relatively recent phenomenon that you have coastal California bottlenose dolphin, harbor porpoise interactions. And this is sort of what the sort of things you see: tooth rakes, fractures, and hemorrhagic lesions, all signs of porpoiside death. All right, here's another one, an observed attack off of San Francisco. A couple images again. There's a porpoise in front, dolphin going after it in the lowercase. We had a poster on this, and I'm getting told I'm about to get the hook, so I'm going to hurry up. One other thing I want to share with you is we have also, in addition to this long distance along shore, very shallow, very near shore record, we have the first or most offshore record for coastal bottlenose dolphins ever, as we got an ID sent to us from colleagues at Point Blue that work out at the Farallon Islands, and we were able to confirm from those photographs that it was coastal, not the offshore bottlenose dolphins, but coastal bottlenose dolphins. Look at the distance, right? 44 kilometers, or if they came from Point Reyes, let's say 32. That's way outside their usual range. And what's more, they had to traverse relatively deep water. Now, these photos were not the greatest, but you can see, if you kind of look at them closely, these are in fact the same individuals. We suspect the bottom one, also because these three individuals hang out together a lot, that it was all three. And we have their movements prior to and just after that. So I'm going to kind of finish with some conservation issues, right? The question is, why have they come north, right? And is this related to changes in climate and oceanographic features? We think it likely is. And this is really a small group of animals. Best estimate, about 650. So working with colleagues at NOAA down south, we really want to revise this population estimate and kind of pose the question, might they not be worthy of or perhaps warrant additional protection, given it's a really small number of animals. You can send sightings, and especially any sightings north of Monterey Bay, through the Marine Mammal Center's website. You can send us pictures. We love to sort of crowdsource information, and I want to thank you guys and all these groups. And somehow my email got cut off. It is .org. There. Feel free to contact me anytime. And I don't know, do we have time for questions still? Okay, great. Any questions? Yeah. Yeah. That'd be awesome. Yeah, we really want to get it all in an online catalog form. And ideally, we will get it to a place where we can share that online catalog with everyone. We don't necessarily need to, hold it all to ourselves. Be able to share it with everybody here. Here are the dolphins along your coast, right? Yeah. That takes people with a little more technological know-how than me, but we are working with the happy whale folks who we work with on the humpbacks to try to develop a little bit more with Ted Cheeseman, him. Yeah. Others, yeah, back there.
So I always thought, or I guess wrongly assumed, that dolphins lived in like family ponds. But then you had mentioned that the lone dolphin had joined or rejoined the pond.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a common thing, that they're multi-families, or is that a...
Thank you for that question. Yeah, this is actually, you noticed I didn't use the word pod. It has multiple meanings. That's part of the challenge. So pod kind of generically just means a group of dolphins, right, of any kind. Within the killer whale lexicon, and I work with orcas up in Alaska, so I know this very well. There are very well-known pods, and those pods are very, very stable. In fact, they're family. So they do something very rare for mammals, which is that not only the daughters and granddaughters and everybody stays with the moms, but the sons and grandsons do too. So they're very, very stable over time. They'll sometimes meet up with other groups. They have dialects. You probably know all this, I can tell from your question. But other species of dolphins tend to have less stable groups. That doesn't mean they don't have consistent partners, but there's more mixing. And if you think about your day, if we just photo ID'd you and tracked you through your day and across weeks and months, you probably wouldn't be in the same 5 or 8 or 10 people. Like you probably had a fusion event where you joined some people at this talk, right? And so most dolphins, we see this fission, fusion, social organization pattern, we call it. So, and that can vary a little bit between species. The dusky dolphins I studied, they join up into groups of 300 or 400, like their cousins, the Pacific white-sided dolphins, along our shoreline here. Bottlenose dolphins, smaller groups, but yes, they join, they split. 2s and 3s go off over here, and then they come back together and meet up at another time. So that's what I mean by fission fusion. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have an interesting comment on their social and then their cultural interaction with humans.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in the Santa Monica Bay.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would find is if I was out on my surfboard or out swimming, even if the dolphins had gone way past where I was, I could go underwater and make sounds that I thought sounded cute and appealing. And often they would come back.
Mm-hmm.
They would circle around and swim with me, or if I was out on my surfboard kind of deep and just, I could like do a little hand drum pattern on my board, and they'd
Mm-hmm.
and they'd come back and bring their babies
Yeah.
and just hang out with me. Like
They're very, very interactive.
especially down there.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's because it's just, a flat sandy bottom and there was very low stress down there. It seemed like they would take time out of their schedule to actually come socialize with the humans.
And do you live up here now?
Huh?
Do you live up here now?
I live up here now.
So did they follow you, or did you follow them?
There you
Well,
go.
I moved up here in the late 80s, to Berkeley in the 90s.
Well, there you go.
Interesting.
There you go. I remember actually when I was working with the dolphins I work mainly with dusky dolphins, but I also work with bottlenose dolphins in New Zealand, in a place called the Marlborough Sounds, shallow little bay, Admiralty Bay. A bottlenose dolphin group came in, and there were some kids, and they started knocking stones together.
Yeah.
They were only like this deep in the water, and they're knocking stones together underwater. And this group of bottlenose dolphins nosed right up to them. And then their dog jumped in. And I've got pictures of the dog swimming with the dolphins in perfect echelon formation. Eventually, of course, the dog, had legs that got in the way and couldn't keep up. But it was really cool. Yeah, they're really, really amazing interactive creatures, for sure. And particularly this species, as I said, has a propensity to, many dolphins will interact with people, but has a propensity to live around harbors and areas where there are a lot of people and interact with people if they so choose. Yeah.
And it was always the bottlenose that would do that. The other ones were too busy, or they were more focused, I think, on their animal culture.
Mm-hmm.
The bottlenose would really interact with the humans.
Yeah, yeah. And these lone sociables, like you've seen them in Ireland, New Zealand, we had one. We called her Maui in Kaikoura. And then they named her Woody up in the Marlborough Sound. She moved up there. So she was lone sociable with people, but then she also joined big groups of dusky dolphins, an interspecies mix. And then she moved up and rejoined her own kind, larger groups in the Sounds, and had a calf they named Woodchip. So there you go.
Great. Thank you, Tim, very
Okay,
much.
out of
That
time.
was a really interesting talk.
Thank you.
All I can think of is don't tell Hollywood, because if not, summer of 2023, the porpoise. Ton, 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 ton. Thank you very much.